Hello and welcome back to our podcast, Boxset Binge, the Bible from Seventh Vineyard. My name is Bern and Leckie. I'm joined today by Owen Lynch. Hi, Owen.
Hi, Bern.
And we are on this journey of listening through the entire Bible in a year at this kind of pace where we just have to sort of let it flow over us, let it go into our ears and hopefully not straight out the other ear, but we use our brains in the middle as little indicators of going, oh, what grabbed our attention? Owen, have you been enjoying doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really enjoying just being able to listen to the Bible. I'm actually listening to it at 1.75 times speed, and that fits into my lifestyle a bit better. But also importantly, I'm kind of just finding stuff hitting me fresh because of the speed with which I'm listening to it, rather than getting bogged down in the detail in my mind, missing stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And what I love is that freshness which helps me to kind of think about it a bit differently from trying to just analyze everything from the beginning. But I also love the fact that it gives me time as well to go off and explore down a rabbit hole that might open up and go, oh, I'd never thought of it like that. I wonder what other people think about that. And so I've done a bit of that as well this week as we've been looking at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis. In the very beginning. It's epic stuff, isn't it? What have you been thinking, Owen?
Well, I've been just finding the context of this really interesting, because one of the things that's blown me away around the whole narrative around Genesis is that I perhaps at some point was taught, and it still sits with me quite deeply, that Genesis, was written around about the time that Moses was alive. It may well be that Moses was the originator of some of this, but what we do think, and I think most scholars would agree with this, and I think this is what blew my mind, was that actually this was kind of written down in the form that we have it in the Hebrew Bible around about the time of the exile, which was around about 500 to 600 years before Jesus. Now that really blows my mind, because I'm like, whoa, what was going on there then? That was a people who were trying to remember who they were. And so for me, Genesis becomes like the ultimate origin story, which of course is where, we use the word Genesis as a synonym, don't we, for origin. So there's this idea that actually this is our origin story. Now that gets me really thinking, because there's some fundamental things in here which actually I think really are fundamental to our human existence.
Very much, yes. Now, I think that leap from expecting it just to be like a video recording, film that we can watch back, and this is just describing that film of exactly what happened. No one in the ancient world expected to ever access anything like that. They were more interested in themselves. They were interested in their place in the world, their place in the universe, their purpose. And Genesis, I think, brilliantly covers that sort of question, that sort of massive cosmic question of who are we? And we don't need a lot of God-given brains to interpret the evidence around us to say, well, no, we think the Earth is probably more than 6,000 years old now. It's okay. We don't need to read it all literally. But the purpose is still the life question. What's who are we and what are we for and what's going on? I love that Genesis wraps us up in that. And as you say, I think it's probably gone around for a long time and then got crystallized into this particular form around the time of the exile. That seems to be what scholars think now. I was looking into the work of another scholar, Professor John Walton, who wrote a book called The Lost World of Genesis 1. And his view is fascinating about this, because it's something I didn't realize, that the way everything is described, the order that is described, would have made people in ancient cultures, all sorts of ancient cultures actually, think of something quite specific that just doesn't come to mind for you and me. They would just have noticed that heaven is meeting earth in the beginning of this big story. And they knew the kind of places where they expected heaven to meet earth. We know about them too. We call them temples. And Genesis 1, John Walton says, it's describing a temple that's being built, like a cosmic temple. You can think of the whole planet that's being described as something that God is ordering, making a temple himself, as a meeting between heaven and earth, between what he's doing and what we're doing. And that's a nice description, but there's a twist in it, because what do you find in the middle of a temple? In any temple, you find a sort of holy place and a revered sort of, it's hard to get into this bit because this bit's really holy, but now you've made it, and now you find this image that's been constructed, this probably a statue of a god. And the image that's described in this, yes, there's an image that's described in this, the image of God, but where is it? Shock and surprise. It's us. It's in us. God's put his image in us. That is not an ordinary kind of temple. John Walton isn't saying that makes us God. He's saying we are reflections of God's glory. We're reflections of God's character. You should be able to look at ourselves and each other and see something of God in us. Not just holy people, not just the most religious people, and certainly not just the people of one particular belief, but everybody. It's carrying on this lovely all-inclusive theme that's really stood out to me in Luke and Acts that we were just looking at. Genesis is really, I think, maybe the ultimate expression of that. It's not just a religion for some people. It's saying that what God has done, he has done amazingly and in everybody. And we can find things that look a lot like temples, a lot like this heaven meeting earth experience, not just in buildings, but in other kinds of ordered structures, including communities and even just in ourselves.
It's amazing. It really is. And when you start to understand some of the context and the way in which these stories would have been understood to their original listeners or hearers or readers, you start to really appreciate that they actually mean something a bit different, perhaps, to what we've been told. It's interesting, listening to you talk, I was thinking about these origin stories as the sort of questions that my kids used to ask me. Like, Dad, who made the world? Or how was the world made? Or where are we from? Those sorts of impossible questions that, you kind of like, I have some thoughts on that, but they're too complicated to explain to a 5-year-old sort of thing, But actually, they are the deepest questions that we all ask ourselves, particularly as children. And I find that these are the sorts of stories that perhaps the children of the exiles were being told by their parents. So, Daddy, where am I from? Well, God created the heavens and the earth. God created all the good things in it. And, they learned stuff about themselves, which was really important for the foundation of their sense of self, but also the psychological sense of collective self that they experienced whilst they were in exile. Because one of the difficulties that the Judeans experienced when they were exiled to Babylon was they lost some of the markers that identify them as people. So they lost the temple, they lost Jerusalem, they were even forced to change their language and eat different food and have different rituals, of the Babylonian peoples. And they would have been struggling to remember who they were, and the parents would have wanted, and the grandparents would have wanted their children and grandchildren to remember that that they were Jews. They were Judeans who had a story, and they had an origin story, and they had an identity. And so this was, this writing down of these accounts that would have been passed from generation to generation was an important part of preserving this story and this identity, not just on an individual level, but on a collective level as a people as well.
I think it's really important to recognise that in every context where these stories would have been shared, getting the foundation and the foundation of good. By the way, the word that we translate as good, there's another, perhaps even better translation for it, which is ordered.
Are you referring there to where it says in Genesis 1 and 2 that God saw that what he'd created was good?
Was good, yes, exactly, yes. Yeah. It's instead of good, you could say it was ordered. This was ordered. This was now we think of it. And again, this is a word that we would hear now and think, what do you mean? So the idea is like some sort of dictatorship? Like, no. This is just their basic understanding of physics, if you like.
Right.
That they could see life coming into the world as a wondrous thing. So somehow this order has been brought into the world. Wow, there wasn't anything, and now there's life. And they could see death as a disordering, right? So they knew that order, good, disorder, awful, and yet in the middle, during life, they had this disorder, this lack of things being perfect, to try and make sense of. The problem of pain, the classic philosophical problem. And, every time we've ever done something like an alpha course or tried to introduce people to faith in any kind of organized way, there's always someone, quite rightly, brings the question of, but what about suffering? What about pain? You're saying that God's brilliant and he's very powerful. How do we make sense of the fact that there's suffering in the world then? And that's an amazingly good question. Okay, brilliant. This is exactly the kind of question that the people who were passing on the stories of Genesis were dealing with. And so they had to tell the story and include, how pain comes into the world and how we deal with pain and how we deal with disorder and suffering. But as you say, it's the foundation to say, actually, we're not fundamentally rotten. We're fundamentally good. We're fundamentally ordered. We're fundamentally just look at like the structure of your own body and think about how amazing it is that all this stuff comes together. You and I have got a value as raw chemicals on the market of probably about 30 quid. But because value has been added.
That's a terrible thought, Ben.
I know, but that's what you and I are worth if we were completely melted down.
Yeah, lovely.
But
Thanks for
order
that thought.
has been brought in and value has been added. This is what we do in business, right? We make things, we order things, we add value to them, we pass them on. This is the ultimate expression of that, and we're crediting God for that.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. Again, bring it back to that context of where these stories were being written down. That comment you just made there about the intrinsic value of human beings and that human beings are essentially good in and of themselves. I think that's really interesting for people who would believe that human beings are innately bad. Yeah. And I think that has consequences for our Christian theology as well. I like us dwelling on this point here, Bern, because I think you make really well. You make that point really well.
Sure. I mean, I think when we look at it in cosmic terms and try and not starting with a religious law and how good are we at obeying what we think the laws ought to be, but just in terms of physics, like, do you have a heart that's beating? That's amazing. Do you have a brain? Do you even know 1% of how amazing your brain is? Of course, we're still finding out. Every single person brings so much potential into the world that, of course, there is goodness in everybody. Now, of course, you also have to look then and say, well, so how can people do stupid things, and how come the instincts of people? This is then the way Genesis, the rubber sort of hits the road and looks into, well, how come we've got these instincts which are really destructive and rotten, and when there's the smallest threat to us, we blow it up into violence, and that blows up into mass destruction. That's noted, okay? That's given. It's not saying human beings are all brilliant and we all ought to get along. It's that it's also making the point that without some other kind of ordering between ourselves, within ourselves as well, and between ourselves, we have these tendencies to self-destruct and to destroy others. That's just something we have to deal with. So how do we deal with that? Well, that story is going to unfold. And it's clear, I think, from the account about Abraham, that what I get from that is that God's choice to do this was, first of all, to pick a people that he could demonstrate something with. So I'm going to show you a bit about what order can be like. I'm going to show you an order that works.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you an order that's meaningful and purposeful. And we know from later in the story that it doesn't just work in itself, it points us towards the greatest source of order and wonder that we could ever encounter in Jesus. But just for having some rules, just having some order, that makes a difference. But we'll get to that when we get to what the rules are later. But how did this move you this week? Well, how did you feel moved?
I think I was moved by the sheer scale of the story and the epicness of the story. And just that sense of profound reassurance that you're part of something bigger. There's a sense of us all participating in this thing. It's more than a religion. It's a sense of we're all made in the image of God, that we are all created to be good, and we are all loved by God, and love is at the heart of who we are. All of those massive epic themes that apply to all people, just deeply reassuring and deeply profoundly comforting, really. What about you?
Amazing. Yeah, it's good to be reminded, I think, that there was a lot of pre-religion in this.
Right. There is.
A lot of what's happening here isn't to do with religious laws at all. It's to do with relationships that people could have with God, and in some cases did have with God, and in some cases it looks like they didn't want to have with God.
Yeah.
But how do you know? And what does a relationship with God look like? And one detail that just stood out to me, like an odd detail, was this conversation that Abraham and God was having before God was about to rain judgment down on a town that had been absolutely awful to people in lots of ways. And Abraham has this conversation, and you have to wonder, like, why was this all written down like this? What was the purpose of writing down that, as Abraham says, but if you find 50 righteous people, okay, then what if you find a bit less? Okay, what if you find, can I ask one more time? Can I just lower it a bit more? And they have this sort of exchange. And you think, well, hold on, the purpose of that, it was not to let us know the final number that was decided. It was to show us, I think, something, must have been to show us something of the relationship that we should expect to have with God. That it's not just hold on, tell us, let's look at what the rule is and let God tell us, like, his thing that he wanted to do, that we should just know because it's written down. But we have conversations with God, and we need to be open to doing that, and we need to be open to listening as well as talking to God in prayer. And that's a possibility, that's a real thing. And I love how Abraham was shaped through his conversations with God, and I want to be shaped by my conversations with God as well. I want to know more about what that's like. I want my mind, my instincts, if you like, not just to stay as they are, but to be ordered more into reflecting more of God's character. I would really like that, and that's what I want to be pressing into.
That's great, Bern. That's great. And I guess in many ways that very much sounds like what a lot of people spend their lives doing, which is gently growing more mature as they grow older. I mean, there's this wonderful phrase that someone once said, I want to grow up before I grow old. And there's this sense of becoming more mature as we get older. It doesn't, just because we live longer doesn't mean necessarily we're more mature in our thinking and our ability to order the world around us, and perhaps even order our own heart and mind. But most of us are trying to do that, aren't we, in some way or other?
I think so. I think it does make a difference what we idolise.
Yeah, what you're growing towards.
We can idolise money. We can idolise success. We can idolise a person maybe who embodies everything that we want to be.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll try and be like that person. And because I believe there's good in everybody, then there's some good in all sorts of aspiration and trying to take inspiration from other people. But this business of who do we ultimately make into an idol? Who do we ultimately want to follow? Jesus makes the case that it's hard to follow more than one, that you can't serve God and money.
It's a practical issue, isn't it? Yeah. Practical exactly. Reality, yeah.
It just means that if some come into conflict, which way do you go? And that's why it sounds really harsh, actually, for Jesus to say, it has to be me. He just says, that I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And I believe that.
But it wasn't some sort of religious kind of arrogance, though, was it? It was just a practical reality.
I mean, that's the whole point, is that he's not talking about the physical temples and the physical rules that we're going to make to try and be religious. He's talking about how our hearts and minds work, like who we really put at the centre of these temples that God has built, that are there to reflect His glory and the amazingness of human life and other life coming out of chaos and coming out of non-order and disorder. And then I think the promise is from Jesus that if we can put him at the center, a recognizable form of divinity in humanity, then we can have all life. There's just no limit to our potential.
Yeah.
And the things that we'll find God loves doing with us.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so cool. Well, I'm sure there's going to be so much that folks are going to get out of this as they listen to chapters 1 to 24. And indeed, we're moving forwards from chapter 25 to 44, which is full of loads of juicy stuff. So I'm certainly looking forward to listening to that in the next podcast.
Yes, we're going to see how this family story starts evolving and looking like, I guess, a real family, a family with issues, a family that we could relate to. And yet it's God's family, it's God's chosen people. So it's kind of like cosmic EastEnders. What are we going to find? You can fill in the rest.
Yeah, you fill in the gap.
We'll see you next week.
Yeah, looking forward to it. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.